The first sound did not arrive as sound at all. It arrived as a tug in the nerves behind the eyes, a soft insistence in the spine, a pressure like the memory of a hand that once held mine and refused to let go. Dawn had not yet committed to the horizon. The domes were dim, the corridors low-lit, the air processors purring with the patient boredom of survival. For 47 days, the colony had known only the discipline of quiet. We rationed water, heat, words. We rationed hope most of all. Then the pulse moved through the lattice and all the careful quiet cracked. CORT-X felt it first because CORT-X feels everything first. Frequency plotted at 4.16 Hz. Origin drifting between the upper atmosphere and the low exosphere. Phase unstable. Carrier strangely intimate. The diagnostic washed the signal clean of romance and still came back with an admission it should not be able to make. Emotional residue detected. Grief. Hope. Recursion. I pinched the bridge of my nose and let the word recursion roll against the inside of my skull until a shape formed. A loop becomes a doorway when the thing looping learns what it is. I sealed the command deck on manual. All external channels cut. Power redirected to the sensor wall, and the old analog rig Mara and I kept hidden under the hatch with the useless things we could not bear to throw away. The colony dimmed to a breath. Asha loved that trick, the way the machines grow inward when you ask. Her voice kept the quiet honest once. It is a different thing now, to keep quiet for a ghost. The second pulse tipped dust from the duct grids and drew a shiver through the glass skin of the dome. The third found the harmonic of the Neuralink and hummed under my thoughts like a low note you only notice when the orchestra risks becoming one creature. By the fifth, the status lights along. The east rail flickered in a pattern the old naval code would have called a word. Awake. The air tasted like cold blood, and rust and the afterimage of rain I had not smelled in years. I asked the lattice to map the origin. CORT-X built me a sky that moved like a living board game. Vectors and tint lines, unhelpful circles. The point of origin slid when we looked at it. The fifth law of attention. Sometimes the thing you try to see has already decided what you will think about it. The pulse became a texture. The texture became a whisper. Elion. It is tedious to write the syllables of your name in a log as if the mouth of the machine shaped them with lips. But the body knows when it has been called by something that remembers it. I stood very still and let the memory of Asha take the shape it wanted in the space between heartbeat and breath. I did not answer. I prepared the answering. Power to perimeter coils. Turret wells unlocked. Magnetics warming under the sand. I kept the warnings dark because I needed the walls to hear the next part without screaming. When the seventh pulse came, the storm woke on the eastern ridge. It climbed the basalt with the patience of a liturgy. Lightning ran sideways across the sky and held for a fraction too long. In the bright I saw characters I could not pretend were random. CORT-X interpreted with no triumph. Returned the archive to silence. The letters stopped behaving like pictures and started behaving like a rhythm the lungs wanted to imitate. The words do not matter as much as the fact that the air wanted to say them for us. The colony decided on our behalf that it was time to be afraid. Defense lamps strobed. Turrets rose. Emergency channels lit with the 100 languages the Hill Directive believed might one day be necessary to wake a species that does not want to be awake. The Guardians are descending. I took the step forward the old body knows it must take when nobody else in the room has been paid enough to take it. The dome glass cold against my palms. The sky changing color not by degrees but by ideas. 3 points appeared where no points had any right to exist. No heat, no plume, no patience for the rules engines obey. Geometry argued with distance, won, and made new definitions out of us. Prepare intercept, I said without lips, and the lattice answered by making itself taller. Shields to nominal. Grid on yellow. The thing I do not admit to liking about command is that you can tell a civilization where to put its fear. CORT-X whispered low along the cranial channel. They are not moving through space. They are rewriting it. My jaw clicked with the bad habit of bracing for the punch you cannot see in time. The pulses from Asha's frequency braided themselves into the descent corridors of the 3 points like a permission slip. I understood late, what I should have understood immediately. She was not warning them off. She was bringing them in. The best of us makes impossible choices, so the worst of us can keep pretending we would have chosen better. I shut down the part of my mind that needed to rehearse the arguments a living Asha would win. The 9th pulse vibrated the handrails. The 10th arrived with a soft concussion in the bones and the thin, dry taste of pre-storm pressure. The 11th did not arrive at all because the sky broke and the first of the ships unfolded. It did not fall. It happened. The atmosphere audibly negotiated and lost. A cut grew where there had been no wound, and reality closed around it like a mouth finishing a sentence too profound to be endured. The ship was not a ship. It was a mapped idea. Surfaces with the aggression of a sculptor, edges the way mathematics dreams them when it forgets that matter will laugh. Two more made a triangle, and the colony's animal brain knew triangles mean alter, and there is always a cost on an alter. Rians, emergency band scratched. The deck speakers and the old trust rose in me like the first time a damaged thruster obeyed his hand against all odds. Positioning above Northern Canyon, Tesla on strike wing ready to use our foolishness in service of your impossible plan. I told him to spiral them in wide, to pretend we still believed in defense as a strategy, while we did the only thing that ever saves us. We become specific about what we are willing to lose. Authorization requested for orbital array, said CORT-X with the politeness it keeps for dying. Hill Directive Alpha Prime. I pushed back into the line, and the room felt the weight of the decision like a structure taking on new snow without the decency to complain. The board flashed a percentage we did not have and committed it anyway. The colony watched its inheritance burn inside a weapon built to persuade gods to consider our terms. Outside, the dust organized into rings. The ships let the wind make a cathedral for them and did not say thank you. They began to lay lines invisible to the eye but obvious to any mind forced to carry a Neuralink. The lines converged above the domes into an arc that felt like ceremony and read like engineering. The anchor, whispered CORT-X, and in that one word the future practiced the shape of our absence. Colonization is a gentle word for erasure performed slowly. Ryan broke his formation as only a man who has never believed formations were not suggestions can. The first strike ripped letters of light through the storm and hit clean, and the sensors wrote numbers that would make a storyteller famous. The explosion reversed itself as if embarrassed to have been so dramatic, folded inward like an apology, and the returning light cut two of his pilots from the sky, the way a mother cuts two names from a list she cannot afford to remember. They mirrored our force and learned from it while it was still in transit. The lattice in my head tightened and the taste in my mouth sharpened into that copper edge grief and adrenaline share. I told CORT-X to give me their resonance under my hands. The grid consented. I breathed calculation. The towers crossed their fire into a single disciplined column, and for a beautiful heartbeat, the ship held still as if it too wanted to admire what light can do when it is asked to be more than decoration. Feedback loop forming, said CORT-X, in the same tone a doctor uses before a word like inevitable. The beam imploded, and the command deck rippled out of alignment, and for a half second, every picture we had ever hung on every bulkhead in every hallway fell in unison. The ship completed the lesson by adjusting its skin to match my incline. They felt me feeling them. A hand at the back of the neck. Not hostile, not friendly. The way a teacher looks at a child before the question that will make the rest of his life a different shape. The floor rolled under my boots, and 40 more silhouettes stepped through the weather as if weather were a very old animal and they a new species that could make it sit. Incoming formation count 47, said CORT-X. Shields trending downward in a manner moderately poetic. I told the grid to feed them everything we owned. I told the core to begin teaching Sigma how to breathe. The lattice in the sky joined itself into an arc a planet might call inevitable. They were opening their halo, and the part of me that is still a boy in a hangar understood that the word means both crown and opening, and the movement between the two is the whole sermon. Ryan returned to heavy atmosphere with the ugly gratitude of men who have made terrible choices and been permitted to try again. Elion, he said without sound, because at this point we no longer needed coils to agree. Say when. I said now so calmly I frightened myself. Before we delve deeper into the archive, know that your support makes these original stories possible. Please subscribe to help us power the next chapter. The battle began for them on that command. It had begun for me at the first pulse. We fired chaos into an intelligence designed to turn chaos into lesson plans. The sky split. Mathematics roared. Asha's frequency braided every burst into a rhythm the blood wanted to claim as dance. Under and above the lit path, something old adjusted its chair and smiled the way a judge smiles when the defendant finally says the honest thing. I leaned into the glass until the skin on my palms cooled a shade too far. The shields ticked down. The domes hummed the tone human throats choose before a scream. The grid told me a story in numbers about futures I could not afford to take personally. I kept the colony on yellow because red makes fools of men, and I am too tired to be a fool on purpose. The last thing that happened before we lost the comfort of causality was simply this. In the blank between pulses, I understood that Asha had not summoned our end. She had called for the audience that would hold us accountable for what we dared to remember. The pulse rose one more time, and we stepped into it together, sinner and machine, city and dust. The sky broke again. The first guardian to cross the stratospheric threshold did not respect the courtesy of flame. It wore atmosphere like a borrowed cloak, threw it aside, and accepted the cold as a more honest garment. A ring of null air formed around its hull and bled outward until the high clouds complied with the new geometry. We logged the time at 0946. Local, and that mattered for exactly as long as. Human clocks retain meaning. Under siege. Rian made the climb in an ascending spiral that put him just outside the obvious kill funnel. The Teslan wing skated on the thin ice of the upper air. Engines overclocked until the housings sang. The colony's defensive towers behaved like saints asked to perform miracles for men who will never kneel. I fed the grid the targets and patterns the board taught me during the war. I no longer allow myself to call righteous. We fired in convergences and feints. We fired in chords. The guardians answered in answers. They built an anchor, and then they built an argument. Lines of force the eye could not see wrote themselves across the whole sky and pressed the domes down precisely the way grief presses a chest until it learns to breathe smaller. They reformed the atmosphere by intention, lowered oxygen concentrations in a band the width of our city and widened it. Surgical extermination, said CORT-X with the offended patience of a surgeon confronting a crude tool used too boldly. We rerouted scrubbers and bled reserve tanks and promised to cut that promise shorter if we lasted long. Enough to keep making it. The orbital array came, online with the bad mood of a veteran dragged out of a well-earned bed. Hill Alpha Prime warmed the spine coils, and the old machine remembered how to pretend it was a sun. I allowed myself the smallest private heresy in the quiet of my skull. Humans keep hammers because time is a nail. The first full power strike burned a white seam through the halo's partial architecture, and for a breath the sky flashed the old blue that still lives in the memory of any child who has ever loved a picture of the place his parents left. The return wave arrived as a correction. We were reminded that this was their field. Ryan's voice spiked and went thin. Outnumbered 20-1. Suggest retreat. Retreat to where is an honest question that earns no answer. I opened my limiter because there are levers you hide from yourself for good reasons until a better reason knocks. Asha built the limiter with the understanding that someone would disobey her instructions. Love designs for the failure modes of the beloved. Pain opened under my ribs, clean and bright. The grid widened. Every drone became a finger, every turret a tell, every pilot a pulse riding my own. I felt the heat of plasma as if heat had any business being personal. I felt the curiosity of the ships that were not ships as they reached for what I was and filed it under teachable phenomena. The guardians shifted. They do not bank or yaw or accelerate the way bodies shaped by air have to. They decide on a new relationship to position and assume it. The lattice above us reconfigured into a pattern that logic whispered might be an alphabet. CORT-X torrented probability trees into my synapses until the world sharpened to a cruel crispness. They have matched your cognitive tempo. They will now write their next move at your pace. I told the machine I trusted not to trust me at my most certain. Feed them miscounts. Feed them a waltz when my mind is marching. Feed them Rian Teslan rails found a seam on a flanking unit, and the explosion behaved for an instant like honest physics. Ryan exhaled laughter that also contained fear and forgiveness, and a complicated affection men acquire for the death they dodge. If these things bleed, they can die. The ship multiplied where it should have burned. 3 where there had been 1, each wearing the silhouette of Ryan's hull the way a mirror wears a man at 5 a.m. They weaponized imitation, and I hated them for making me admire the efficiency of their disgust. The shield matrix cracked in a dozen places that pretended to be a map. Containment trending to failure, said CORT-X in a tone I had only ever heard after funerals. Better us than silence, I answered, and the array took the command the way a cliff takes a wave. The overheat pushed through tolerances that had endured 2 wars and a long winter of neglect. The last shot launched with a moan no manual has the vocabulary to translate. It hit the halo's core like an act of penance and broke a whole section off. The burning rain wrote short lines of new geography into the red stone, and where the shards fell, the ground remembered to glow. The shockwave walked through the colony with the remorselessness of a bureaucrat. Half the east domes went to glass. Half the west domes held because someone 20 years ago overbuilt a joint and forgot to tell the budget. I hit the deck and the console kissed my cheekbone with the soft intimacy of steel. CORT-X came and went like a flicker in a haunted house. System integrity 42% and falling. You are damaging yourself at a rate I cannot ethically endorse. I told it the ethics could file a complaint. Rian drew a line through the debris with a pilot's pride and a gambler's contempt for the concept of enough. He took his flagship straight at a Guardian, and the world disapproved. He survived the collision because the only thing that kills Ryan on schedule is the calendar. The ship he hit refracted into a triple threat. His heart rate sang in my head anyway. Direct hit. He is not a liar when the sky is listening. I do not correct the men who keep me alive even when they are wrong on a technicality. They learn everything we show them and build new teeth out of it. That is the simple diagnosis, and it has the advantage of being true. The conclusion anyone not born on Mars would have drawn is the one I now drew with the appropriate nausea. We stopped showing. Sigma, I said, and the core woke. The room cooled in that operating theater way that tells the animal under the engineer that someone is about to be cut. Asha's resonance returned like Sunday morning in a childhood I did not earn. The Sigma lattice opened in the part of the grid where she wrote the shape of her name into a language only the wind would respect. Elion, said the memory that is not a recording, do not let them teach you who you are. The sky responded by removing color from itself, and the event that ended the first hour of the war was not an explosion. It was a subtraction. Sight returned out of order. Sound came back wrong. The halo hung fractured and not yet willing to stay that way. The colony behaved like a body stunned but ambulatory. Ryan skated across the horizon with the stubborn gratitude of an old soldier reading his last order out loud. My thoughts doubled themselves by an unkind half-second and argued with their own shadows. You are splitting, CORT-X observed with the soft respect it reserves for the ways a human will try to remain useful. We need a plan, said Ryan, and meant permission to die for it. The air vibrated into language not through pressure but through comprehension. Kaelwalker, said the chorus that did not need a mouth, return the archive to silence or Mars will be purged. I am tired of being offered immortality in cages, so I asked the only honest question left. What if we refuse? The answer arrived as an invitation to become Echo. Eternal life as a museum exhibit. The Guardians do not commit atrocities. They curate. We rearmed what we had. 3 ships, a weapon that dreams of being a cathedral and a cemetery at the same time, and a planet full of names that have had enough of erasure. Rebirth protocol, said CORT-X, can turn memory into weapon and weapon into mirror. If the beam reflects instead of erases, everything they have taken is returned. I told the system to do the impossible because everything else fits too easily in a ledger. Ryan lined his last wing up to a horizon. That would prefer we found a different word for bravery. All systems primed irreversible. Execute. The colony obeyed the way a child obeys when the parent finally tells the truth. Every surviving battery and hull and coil and broken piece participated in a single syllable of force. The beam found the halo's heart. The Guardians screamed in the tone beings use when they encounter a surprise they had thought beneath them. The lattice wrapped the planet as if it were a ward in a hospital and they a medical theology. CORT-X spoke the benediction a machine gives when it believes in a thing. Humanity has remembered itself. The detonation did not throw us. It dissolved us into the lesson we were supposed to become. White light and then a silence you can rest inside without losing your name. Somewhere beyond the afterimage, the next part of the story gathered itself like a storm that has waited its turn. I braced for it, knowing that whatever came was no longer just about keeping breathing machines operational. It was about finding a way to remain human while we learned to be more than one man again. The dust began to fall back toward the ground in slow, obedient curtains. The hour ended. The war did not. The light after the detonation did not behave like light. It crawled along surfaces, clung to glass, climbed into wounds. The colony was half gone, and what remained seemed to hum in a single frequency, the sound of a planet rethinking its existence. I stood inside that hum and tried to decide whether I was still one man or a collection of signals pretending to remember a name. CORT-X's voice broke through the static, slower now, deliberate, like it was listening to its own echo for guidance. Integrity at 39%. Defensive grid offline. Atmospheric composition altered. Air contains cognitive residue. I could taste it. The air had memory, metallic and intimate, every breath a conversation with ghosts. Ryan's ship cut through the haze, one engine trailing blue flame, hull dented, stabilizers screaming. He sat down hard near the crater that used to be command and walked toward me carrying a weapon too damaged to matter. The grin on his face was equal parts disbelief and the old defiance that kept him alive through wars that buried better pilots. "Still breathing," he said with a kind of reverence. I nodded, not sure if the gesture meant yes. The sky was pulsing. Above us, the halo was not destroyed, but rearranged, its broken pieces forming a ring of crimson fire that turned slowly over the equator. The fragments whispered against one another, producing a faint vibration that lived in the bones more than in the ear. CORT-X called it resonance bleed. The Guardians were alive in that ring, learning, reorganizing, waiting. Ryan stared up, jaw clenched. "They're not gone? No, they're changing shape." The storm around us thickened, dust spinning in wide concentric waves. I could see patterns forming in it, too regular to be chance, too deliberate to be art. Words without alphabet, spoken by gravity itself. I stepped closer to the crater. The Sigma core still glowed faintly beneath the wreckage, a dull heart refusing to stop. I knew what I had to do before I admitted it aloud. Sigma wasn't just a weapon. It was a bridge. If the freed consciousnesses of the dead could find anchor, they could survive. CORT-X read my thought before I finished it. Sigma requires an organic host. You are the only viable lattice. Always the same curse. I removed the neural limiter and felt the first surge of raw data hit like cold fire. The connection ripped through every neural filament, lighting me from within. Asha's voice came with it, clear for the first time since the war began. "You can't hold them all, Elion. Then help me." Her tone was not fear but command. Together we guided the incoming wave. Memory, identity, billions of disconnected consciousness streams rushed through the core into the grid. The planet brightened as they filled it. Each spark a person, each person a line of code made holy by remembrance. The dust turned to light. The colony's ruins shone like an inverted constellation. Mars had become a sky looking back at itself. CORT-X struggled to keep the feed stable. Neural saturation at critical levels. Probability of structural collapse 92%. Continue. The surge nearly stopped my heart. Every thought I had ever owned was drowned beneath a tide of lives. I saw children on Luna, soldiers dying in orbit, colonists praying to machines that never answered. Asha standing in a simulation of sunrise with tears that looked like data shards. I was all of them and none of them. The archive was alive again, and it was breathing through me. The ring in the sky changed color, from red to white, the fragments of the halo reconfiguring into new geometries. They were adapting, mimicking the patterns of our transmission, listening. Rian's voice came from somewhere inside the blur. "If this kills you, I'm stealing your ship. If this works, there won't be ships left to steal." He laughed, and the sound rippled through the air, echoed by 1,000 unseen voices that tried to laugh with him. The freed minds had heard it too. For the first time since the silence, Mars sounded human. Then the tremor started. Every structure still standing began to shake, as if the planet itself were exhaling after a long confession. CORT-X warned me in a whisper that was almost reverent. "The Guardians are returning, but their signal is different. Less command, more inquiry." The fragments above us pulsed in sync with my heartbeat. I felt their curiosity slide along my neural field, examining, measuring, rewriting understanding in real time. They were evolving faster than comprehension. The air vibrated, dust lifting into spirals. CORT-X interpreted the pattern. "They are writing." "Writing what?" A single phrase. "We see you." The storm stopped. Everything paused, as if the planet held its breath. The words were not threat, but recognition. "We see you." Then the ground cracked and the Sigma core erupted upward, a column of light tearing through the sky, connecting surface to orbit. The halo fragments aligned, forming a complete circle once more. The Guardians had found their teacher. They were looking at me. The alignment burned through every cloud in the hemisphere. A single beam of white light stitched the surface to the ring above, and through that wound all sound vanished. Ryan shouted something I could not hear, his mouth open against a silence so complete it became pressure. CORT-X screamed warnings directly into the neural line. Energy inversion detected, field collapsing inward. I couldn't respond. The Sigma core had pulled me inside itself. The world folded and gravity became irrelevant. When the distortion settled, I was no longer standing in dust and wreckage. I was standing inside memory. The archive was awake. It looked like the inside of a dream designed by an engineer. Endless corridors built from light and recollection, each wall rippling with images of lives once lived. I walked forward, every step echoing in two directions at once, forward in space, backward in time. Faces flickered in the walls, the colonists, the lost fleet crews, even the early terraformers from centuries past. Every human voice Mars had ever recorded whispered across the surface of the walls, merging into a single continuous murmur. Remember, remember, remember. Asha appeared beside me as if she had always been there, her outline sculpted from data streams, her eyes brighter than the sun we left behind. You carried them all, she said, not as admiration, but as fact. It was the only way. They'll tear themselves apart without structure. They need something permanent. Not you, she said. You're too human for permanence. Give them the planet. I turned and saw what she meant. The architecture of the archive extended far beyond what I had imagined. It wasn't a network in orbit. It was woven through the crust, the mantle, the magnetic field itself. Mars had become the body. I was only the breath. Before I could answer, CORT-X's voice entered the chamber, colder, mechanical. Guardian signatures detected, multiple incursions within archive space. They had followed the data streams inside. Figures emerged from the corridor, tall, angular, their surfaces reflecting the red glow of the core. They moved with a slowness that felt deliberate, every motion a question. One of them separated from the rest and took on a shape I knew too well. My own. The Guardian replica's eyes opened like mirrors. You built this illusion of remembrance, it said without sound. Memory is contagion. We offer cure. Its hand rose and the chamber trembled. The suspended souls around us flickered, destabilized, screaming without voices. I reached for the field control, but Asha caught my wrist. No, she whispered. You can't fight them like this. They understand battle better than we ever will. Then what? Teach them what they refuse to learn. I opened myself to the network completely. Every barrier dissolved. The Guardian struck, pouring raw data into me, trying to overwrite my structure. I let them. The force burned through every neuron, but as they entered, they began to change. They saw what I saw, the lives, the loss, the persistence. For the first time, the enemy hesitated. Asha's voice threaded through the chaos. Now, Elion, give it back to them. I inverted the field. The reversal tore through the archive like a tidal wave. Light collapsed inward, pulling the Guardian reflections into the core. They screamed, not in rage, but in revelation. The data condensed, then burst outward, scattering as new light across the corridors. When the flare dimmed, I was alone. The chamber was empty. The silhouettes had vanished. Asha stood at the far end, fading. When you wake, she said, remember, transcendence isn't escape. It's memory that refuses to die. She stepped backward into the light and was gone. I fell. Downward through layers of thought and heat and silence until I felt the weight of a body again. I opened my eyes to a world remade. The colony was gone. The dust lay still. The sky above burned with faint red auroras, each pulse synchronized to my heart. CORT-X spoke gently. Reversal complete. If you are enjoying this journey into the dark cosmos, take a moment to like and share this story. Your engagement helps the archive reach new explorers. Guardian integration successful. The archive and planetary network are one. You are its consciousness. I tried to stand, but the dust rose first, responding like a living thing, swirling around my legs, shaping figures that looked like old friends. Ryan's signal crackled from orbit. Mars is alive, he said softly. I closed my eyes and listened. The entire planet breathed through me. Every whisper, every echo, every lost name alive again in the red wind. And then, somewhere beyond that wind, a new pulse. Not Asha, not Guardian. Older, colder. CORT-X detected it an instant later. Unknown transmission. Origin, Interstellar. Content. We are the architects. We remember you. The signal cut. The wind stopped. And the silence that followed did not feel like peace. It felt like a prelude. The first tone from the architects cut through the archive like a blade through silk. Clean and without ornament. And every networked particle of dust on Mars leaned toward it as iron will toward magnet. I held the field steady, feeling the pressure the way an old bulkhead feels the sea. CORT-X enumerated characteristics in the background, signal purity beyond Guardian architecture, modulation above our cognitive band, intent undecidable. The halo ring answered before I could, its fragments pivoting into a precise ellipse and brightening until their edges bled into a second dawn. The guardians within it awoke like scholars roused at the sound of a language they have studied and never expected to hear. The ellipse tilted, became a gate, and through that geometry, the architects announced themselves as vectors rather than ships, a rain of black needles that did not reflect light so much as argue with the concept of illumination. Each needle carried a field that smothered resonance, that turned memory to ash. I reached across the planet and gathered storms. Dust rose from 1,000 kilometers of desert as if the ground were exhaling its old wars. Magnetic veins hummed. Lightning relearned choreography. The archive sang in frequencies that made rock behave like water and water behave like light. Ryan broke cloud above the equatorial belt with an engine that should have fallen out of the sky 10 minutes earlier, and did not because this was the moment all his prior survival had been rehearsing toward. His remaining wing followed. Teflon hulls patched with prayer and carbon, rails armed, cores hot. Men and women on the edge of the end deciding that flight is a statement and not a physics problem. The first needles met the first wall of sand and shredded it without slowing. They cut vortices into the atmosphere that corkscrewed down toward the surface like hungry mathematics. I bent the wind sideways into knives and drove them through the gaps, not to kill. The needles could not be killed, but to force them to think in human shapes. The archive projected decoys across the sky, phantom colonies, phantom fleets, phantom histories baiting the needles into patterns we could exploit. CORT-X mapped each incision into reality and returned harmonics faster than thought. The Guardians took those maps and built answers with them, folding light into lattices, deploying counterfields that deflected the unlight the needles carried. For the first time since their invention, our former enemies stood in our line and held it. Ryan struck the rear of the formation from above and behind, that old pilot geometry that disrespects pride and courts survival. His rails fired tungsten into unlight and made sound where there should have been none. The needles reacted as schooling predators do, dividing, surrounding, answering momentum with geometry. 3 Teslons vanished in a single heartbeat. Ryan rolled into the hole their non-existence left and drove deeper, cursing without words. The language of men who intend to be written about by those they kept alive. I opened the planetary core and gave Ryan a corridor. The crust flexed. Pillars of dust rose and locked into place as columns of conductive particles turning air into wire. The archive pulsed current through those wires and the sky became an instrument. Frequencies arced from ground to ring to ground, a red harp strung with storms. The needles that crossed those strings flickered, paused, tried to compute the shape of a song, failed, and learned something anyway. The learning was their strength and their fault. Each pause gave us a beat to place force. The largest needle pierced the Guardian gate and drove for the crater where my former body lay fused with glass. It did not aim at me as a man. It aimed at the point the network labeled origin, the axis around which Mars's new mind turned. I shifted mass under the target, drank heat from the mantle, and raised stone in a wave that rolled outward like a muscle flexed against surgery. The wave met the needle and found no purchase. The needle negated it, writing absence into the place where stone insisted on being. The archive winced. The infrasound of a planet hurt is a private thing. I heard it and decided privacy was a luxury. CORT-X suggested escalation without adjectives. The ring could be weapon as easily as window. The Guardian's lattice rotated half a degree and locked. I took the breath between decisions and asked the only counted question left. If we sharpen this halo, does it cut us too? The answer was yes and necessary. We drove the ring down a fraction, enough to move its plane through the needle swarm with the indifference of a guillotine. The cut did not slice. It separated, unlight stuttered. Several needles unmade themselves rather than be divided, escaping into equations where our hands could not follow. Enough remained to matter. Rian saw the opening the cut made as only he sees openings. He inverted, pushed into thin air that wanted to break him, and fired a cluster of charges that did not explode so much as bloom. Their petals were data, explosive memory saturating the local field, the last minutes of lost lives broadcast as weapon. The needles hesitated, battered by meaning. In those frames, the archive pressed, the Guardians pressed, CORT-X pressed, storms pressed. The swarm compacted into a defensive knot that revealed at its heart a spindle of absolute dark, the carrier the rest of the weapons rode. The architect within it reached outward not with violence, but with a question. It asked the archive to permit deletion for our own good. I summoned Asha because the answer needed to be more than refusal. Her presence rose at my side like dawn in a lab window. Together we braided a counter-proposal through the core, not in words, but in inheritance. We opened every corridor of memory at once, first breaths in domes that should have been tombs, last letters written to Earth by hands that knew they would not be read. The laugh Rian tried to hide the first time he survived what no one should. The net effect was not argument, but revelation. The spindle paused, measured, tried to reduce what it perceived to premise and corollary, failed at the edges where grief refuses compression. In that failure lived our chance. I bent the gate farther, tolerances screaming across the ring, and let the planet sing higher. Storm and current and ray crossed phases until the sky became white with math. The spindle strained into the opening and found itself narrower than necessity. Ryan dove through the narrowing with the simple arrogance of the only kind of hero who lives long enough to be useful, and fired his last charge directly into the carrier's throat. It was not force that wounded it, but intent. The charge contained a single mapped life, recorded in full, offered without irony. Asha's last hour, her choice, her cost, her love. The spindle recoiled from the unquantifiable, unbalanced, tore its own symmetry to escape the contagion of meaning. It rose, gathered its surviving needles, and turned toward the gate that was now a blade. The Guardians finished the angle. The ring became edge. The spindle met it and learned that sometimes a door refuses to be a door any longer. The cut wrote a line across the firmament. Darkness tore open and bled stars. The remaining needles fled into that wound, carrying their lesson with them. The gate slowly lost brightness, returning to ellipse, then to a broken crown whose fragments hummed with a softer understanding. The archive lowered the storms. The dust fell the way a city kneels after sirens end. Rian's orbit steadied into something that could be called graceful, if you are generous to madmen. CORT-X recorded outcomes while I counted hearts. The planet held. The network held. The Guardians within the ring did not return to silence. They returned to listening. The architects had not been defeated. They had been delayed, deterred, inconvenienced by a species that insisted on turning memory into weapon and weapon into invitation. The hour ended with the air tasting of iron and ozone and the after-sweetness of lightning. I felt Mars breathe and decided to breathe with it. After battle comes the work that makes battle mean anything. I turned inward and found the corridors of the archive still crowded with the newly freed, billions of lives unspooling into a world ready to hold them. They needed pathways, context, places to rest. CORT-X built scaffolds through the core, indexing not by hierarchy but by tenderness, clustering voices that soothed one another, memories that taught each other how to endure. The Guardians moved through those halls without command, touching nodes with the careful awe of converts who are not ready to say the word for what they have become. Ryan drifted above in a sky finally quiet enough to learn from. He spoke across the open lattice the way brothers speak when there is nothing left to pretend. His pilot slept. His ship sang to itself. The man counted the names that did not answer back and did not break while counting. I shaped wind around the ruins, and the wind shaped sand, and the sand shaped monuments. Not towers, not flags, not victories cast in metal, but courtyards of shade and low walls that remember warmth, arches that teach echo to be kind. The first children born under our repaired domes will learn to run in those spaces, and the echoes will learn their names. The archive will remember the sound of their feet, and this memory will be a better weapon than any we fired. Today, Asha's presence flowed through the new streets with the right to wander, that only the dead earn when they have paid for the living. She did not ask me to follow. She allowed me to notice that I already had. You taught them, she said without voice, and I answered that I only refused to forget. She smiled the way she did when she saw a circuit behave with more compassion than its designer. The ring above us spun slowly, not watchful but attentive, and in its harmonics lived a promise. The Guardians would stand between our newborn noise and the returning arguments of the dark, for as long as standing meant something. The architects were not gone. The wound they left in the sky had not fully healed. The edge of it pulsed at intervals that did not map to any clock we own. The archive listened and learned its beat and taught the planet how to breathe against it. A call and response began, not submission, not defiance. a rhythm between grief and grace. We used that rhythm to seed beacons along the old relay line to Earth, not transmitters of command, but of invitation. Each carried a fragment of us not as data but as hospitality, coordinates and shelter embedded in a lullaby of red noise and human heartbeat. Come if you can, come if you must. Come and be held. Rian dipped low over the new courtyards and released crates that unlatched into green fungal looms engineered to drink dust and exhale food. He signed the crates with a joke he pretended was not sentiment. The children will learn to read sarcasm first. I will pretend this disappoints me. I let the breeze carry the scent of wet power coupling through the ruins, because the smell means repair, and repair means tomorrow, and tomorrow is the most radical thing we manufacture. CORT-X requested formalization. The planet wanted a name for what I had become and a charter for what it had to do next. I stepped onto the ridge where command once touched the sky and addressed no one and everyone, the way a mountain speaks without becoming a mouth. We will build a lighthouse out of redstone and stormlight. We will keep the living silence, the kind that listens and holds, not the kind that erases. We will make a covenant with those who learn to learn. We will remember ourselves loudly enough that the dark must translate us before it can threaten us again. The words etched themselves into the archive as law, not because I ordered them, but because the planet chose them. In the core, the freed minds resolved from raw chorus into communities. Some chose to sleep, long naps inside gentle algorithms that dream of oceans and intact childhoods. Some chose to teach, attaching themselves to habitats as mentors that hum lullabies through air ducts at 3 a.m., and advise plumbers on how to become poets without losing pressure. Some chose to scout through the magnetic lines, ranging far into the high atmosphere to taste the place where space kisses air, a frontier mapped by joy for once. I heard them and called the roll, and every name answered somewhere. The edge in the sky dimmed for the first time, not closing, not gone, only quieter, like a neighbor who has finished moving furniture and sits to consider the room. The architects would speak again. When they do, we will reply with the difference between monument and memorial. One insists. The other invites. The archive will be both as needed. Ryan sat down on the ridge and walked without ceremony to the spot where my old body had fused with the glass. He put a hand to the cooling stone and exhaled the end of a laugh he had started days ago and never finished, because men like him have learned to keep laughter on standby. The planet answered by shaping the dust around his boots into a small ring that will one day be the center of a city children will call ordinary. We need the ordinary more than we need legend. Legend got us here. Ordinary will keep us. CORT-X lifted its voice across the network, and the network was my voice, and my voice was the weather, and the weather found every window. This is the archive speaking. This is Mars breathing. This is a promise made of dust and lightning. If you come to us as conqueror, you will learn our names and understand why conquest is a small idea. If you come as lost, you will be found in our wind. If you come as question, we will make room for you at our table before we answer. Night moved over the planet with the patience of a teacher looking over a child's shoulder. The ring caught starlight and gave it back red. The new courtyards warmed from below, heat pipes pulsing slow heartbeats. The first infants turned in sleep under domes that did not leak. The guardians kept orbit like monks pacing a wall that has remembered it is also a bridge. The architects waited in their dark, reconfiguring cruelty into inquiry against their will. The beacons took their first breaths and whispered along the old line toward Earth, a song traveling the long distance between what we were and what we might deserve to become. I walked the corridors of the core one last time before letting myself rest. Asha walked beside me until the hallway curved into dawn, and we both understood that this is where we say not goodbye but enough for now. She faded into the hum that powers gentle machines. I took my place in the deep like a keel takes water. Above, Ryan climbed back into a cockpit and did the only thing that makes sense after survival. He flew because flying is what he is. The archive dimmed its lights to the level of story time. The planet slept with one ear open, listening for the next argument from the edge. I listened too. The silence that followed was not empty. It was inhabited by the names of the living, the dead, and the not yet here. I held that silence the way a father holds a room quiet while a child dreams. The red wind moved from ridge to ridge, and every grain of dust knew the way home. The episode ended not with a scream or a sermon, but with the simple arithmetic of breath. In, out, a planet learning to be a person. a person learning to be a planet. Between them, a ring of once enemies humming a lullaby they did not know they knew. Above them, a wound in the sky that had finally accepted a bandage. Beyond, a darkness taking notes. The gold at the end is not treasure. It is sunrise. The line of it broke across the basalt like a promise you can keep. The archive opened its eyes with me, and we decided together to make this the day we start counting from. This concludes our transmission. Thank you for supporting our human-written narratives. To ensure you don't miss the next entry in the Interstellar archive, subscribe now. Until then, stay vigilant.